The outlaw's horse knew the way to every hideout until the day it led the sheriff straight to them. The horse was the color of old leather, brown, and weathered like everything else in this country that had seen too much sun. Jake Morrison ran his hand down the animal's neck, feeling the familiar warmth of muscle and bone beneath skin that knew his touch. 3 years they had been together, 3 years of running and hiding and staying one step ahead of the law. The horse had never failed him. Not once. "Good boy, Dusty," Jake whispered into the morning air. His voice was rough from sleep and the whiskey he'd drunk the night before. The horse turned its head slightly, one dark eye looking back at him with something that might have been understanding. Or judgment. Jake could never tell the difference anymore. They stood at the edge of a small town called Cedar Flats, nothing more than a handful of buildings scattered along a dirt road that led nowhere important. The sun was still low, painting the wooden storefronts in shades of gold and shadow. Jake could see the general store from where he sat in the saddle, could see the old man inside moving around behind the counter, getting ready for another day of selling flour and beans, and hope to people who had very little of any of it. Jake's stomach was empty. His pockets were empty too, except for 3 bullets and a piece of paper with his face drawn on it. $500, it said. Dead or alive. The drawing didn't look much like him anymore. 3 years of running had changed a man's face, carved new lines around his eyes and mouth, left shadows in places where there used to be light. The horse shifted beneath him, patient but restless. Dusty knew what was coming. The animal always knew. Jake had learned to read the signs in those dark eyes, the way the ears moved forward or back, the set of the head when danger was near or when it was time to run. But this morning was different. This morning, the horse seemed to be watching him instead of watching the world around them. "Just one more, old friend," Jake said, his hand moving to the gun at his side. "Just one more, and then we can rest for a while." The lie tasted bitter in his mouth. There would never be rest, not for men like him. Not for men who had crossed lines that couldn't be uncrossed, who had done things that left stains on their souls deeper than blood on their hands. But a man had to eat, and winter was coming, and the horse needed grain more than Jake needed a clean conscience. He rode Dusty down the main street, slow and easy, like any other drifter looking for work or a hot meal. The few people who were out this early didn't pay him much attention. A woman hanging laundry behind the boarding house. A boy leading a milk cow down the street. An old dog sleeping in the shade of the saloon porch. Normal people living normal lives, the kind of lives Jake had given up the right to dream about a long time ago. The general store bell chimed when he pushed through the door. The old man behind the counter looked up from his ledger book and smiled. It was a real smile, warm and welcoming, the kind that said he was glad to see another human face on what promised to be a quiet day. "Morning," the shopkeeper said. "What can I do for you?" Jake looked around the store. Shelves lined with canned goods and dry goods, barrels of flour and sugar, bolts of cloth that some woman would turn into dresses for her children. All of it honest. All of it earned through hard work and fair dealing. Everything Jake had forgotten how to do. "Need some supplies," Jake said. His voice came out steadier than he felt. "Food for the trail." "Traveling far?" the old man asked, already reaching for a cloth sack to fill with whatever Jake might need. "Far enough." The shopkeeper's name was Henry Walsh, though Jake would never know that. Would never know that Henry had been running this store for 15 years, that he had a wife named Martha who made the best apple pie in 3 counties, that he had grandchildren who visited every Sunday and called him Papa. Would never know that Henry gave credit to families who were struggling, that he had never turned away a hungry child, that he said his prayers every night and meant every word. All Jake saw was an old man with soft hands and a money box behind the counter. "Got any jerky?" Jake asked. "Best in the territory," Henry said, turning to reach for a jar on the shelf behind him. "My wife makes it herself. Uses a secret spice that—" Jake drew his gun. The sound of the hammer clicking back seemed to fill the entire store, seemed to fill the entire world. Henry turned around slowly, the jar of jerky still in his hands, and Jake watched the man's face change as he understood what was happening. The smile faded first, then the warmth in his eyes, replaced by something that was sadder than fear. "Please," Henry said quietly. "I've got a family." Jake's hand was shaking. He could feel sweat on his forehead despite the cool morning air. Through the window, he could see Dusty standing where he'd left him, head turned toward the store as if the horse was watching everything that happened inside. "The money," Jake said. "All of it." Henry's hands moved slowly to the money box, never taking his eyes off Jake's gun. The old man's fingers were steady as he lifted the lid, steadier than Jake's gun hand. There wasn't much inside. Maybe $40 in bills and coins. Enough to buy grain for the horse and food for a week. Not enough to justify what Jake was about to do, but he was past the point where justification mattered. "That's all there is," Henry said, holding out the money. Jake reached for it, and in that moment, their hands almost touched. He could see the wedding ring on Henry's finger, worn smooth from years of wearing. Could see the small cut on the man's thumb where he'd probably nicked himself while opening crates of goods. Could see the humanity in him, the simple goodness of a man who had chosen to spend his life helping others instead of hurting them. That was when Jake made the mistake that would change everything. Henry's hand moved, not toward a weapon or an alarm, but toward a small bell on the counter. A signal to his wife in the back room that there was trouble. A husband's instinct to protect the woman he loved. Jake's finger tightened on the trigger before his mind could stop it. The gunshot was impossibly loud in the small space. Henry fell backward, clutching his shoulder, blood spreading across his white shirt like spilled wine. He was still alive, would recover from the wound, but Jake didn't know that. All he saw was the blood and the way the old man's eyes went wide with pain and surprise. Jake grabbed the money and ran. Outside, Dusty was waiting, but something had changed in the animal's posture. The horse's ears were pinned back, and when Jake swung into the saddle, he felt resistance for the first time in 3 years. Dusty took a step backward, then another, as if the horse was reluctant to carry him away from what had just happened. "Come on, boy," Jake said, his voice sharp with panic. "We gotta go." But as they rode out of Cedar Flats, Jake noticed something he had never noticed before. The horse kept looking back, as if Dusty was trying to memorize the place they were leaving behind. As if the animal understood that something important had been broken in that store, something that couldn't be fixed by running faster or hiding better. Miles later, when they stopped to rest by a creek, Jake watched Dusty drink the clear water and wondered if horses could feel shame the way men did. The horse that had always known the way to safety now seemed to be carrying them both towards something else entirely, something that felt less like escape and more like a reckoning that was long overdue. Sheriff Tom Bradley knelt beside the cold ashes of Jake Morrison's campfire and pressed his palm against the ground. Still warm. Maybe 2 hours ahead, maybe less. Close enough that if Bradley pushed hard, he might catch up before dark. Close enough that this time, finally, he might get his man. The borrowed mare stamped her feet behind him, impatient with the stop. Bradley didn't blame her. The horse didn't know him, didn't trust his hands on the reins or his weight in the saddle. She had belonged to Jim Fletcher before the fever took him last month, and now she carried a stranger through country she didn't recognize, following trails that led to violence and men with guns. Bradley missed his own horse every day. A big gray stallion named Thunder who had carried him through 8 years of keeping the peace, 8 years of chasing men like Morrison across half of Texas. Thunder had known his thoughts before Bradley knew them himself, could sense danger before it showed itself, could run all day and still have strength left for a fight. But Thunder was buried under a pile of rocks in a canyon 50 miles north of here, shot down during a chase that had ended with empty hands and a broken heart. The mare was a good horse, gentle and strong, but she didn't understand the work the way Thunder had. She shied at sudden sounds, hesitated when Bradley needed her to trust his judgment, pulled at the bit when they needed to move fast. It was like trying to dance with a partner who didn't know the steps. Bradley stood up and walked around the campsite, reading the signs Morrison had left behind. The man was getting careless, or maybe just tired. 3 years of running would wear down anyone, even someone as slick as Jake Morrison. There were boot prints in the soft dirt by the creek, deep enough to show that Morrison was favoring his left leg. An old wound, maybe, or just the ache that came from too many nights sleeping on hard ground. But it was the apple cores that made Bradley stop and stare. 4 of them, scattered around the fire pit, like someone had been sitting there for a while, taking their time with a meal. But these weren't just apple cores. Someone had cut them neat and clean, removing every bit of good fruit before throwing away what was left. Cut them with a knife, careful and precise, the way you'd prepare food for someone you cared about. Bradley picked up one of the cores and turned it over in his hands. The cuts were fresh, made that morning, and there wasn't a scrap of apple meat left on the white center. Whoever had done this hadn't wasted anything. But Jake Morrison traveled alone. Always had, according to every report Bradley had read. The man didn't trust anyone enough to share a campfire, let alone share food. So who had been cutting apples with such care? The mare nickered softly, and Bradley looked up to see her nosing around something near a cluster of rocks. He walked over and found more apple pieces, these ones scattered on the ground like someone had been feeding them to an animal. Horse treats, cut into small pieces that wouldn't choke or cause harm. Bradley felt something cold settle in his stomach. Morrison had been feeding his horse, taking time to cut up apples and share them with the animal that carried him from place to place, from crime to crime, from one broken life to the next. It was a small kindness, the kind of thing a man did when he still had some part of his heart left whole. The sheriff had been hunting Jake Morrison for 2 years, ever since the man had robbed the bank in Sweetwater and killed a deputy in the process. Bradley had studied every witness report, every description, every crime that had Morrison's name attached to it. He had built a picture in his mind of a cold killer, a man who had chosen evil over good so many times that there was nothing left in him worth saving. But men who fed apples to their horses, men who took time to cut them careful and small, those men still had something human left inside them. Bradley mounted the mare and followed Morrison's trail up into the hills, but his thoughts kept drifting back to those apple cores. His own father had done the same thing when Bradley was a boy, back on the farm in Missouri. Every evening, after the work was done, his father would sit on the porch and cut up an apple with his pocket knife, sharing half with the old mule and eating the other half himself. It was a ritual, a quiet moment of connection between man and animal, a recognition that they were partners in the business of getting through another day. The memory made Bradley's chest tight with something that felt too much like sympathy for a man he was sworn to bring to justice. The trail led through a narrow canyon where the walls rose up on both sides like the ribs of some great beast. The mare's hooves echoed off the rock, and Bradley could feel the animal's nervousness in the way she held her head, the quick steps that said she wanted to be out of this place and back in open country where she could see what was coming. Bradley understood the feeling. There was something about these canyons that made a man feel trapped, made him think about all the ways a hunt could go wrong. Morrison could be waiting around any bend, rifle ready, patient as a spider in its web. Or he could be miles away already, following some trail that only he and his horse knew about. But the tracks were fresh, and there were more signs now. A place where Morrison had stopped to water his horse, letting the animal drink its fill while he kept watch. Hoof prints that showed the horse was still sound, still carrying its rider with the steady gait of an animal that was well cared for. More apple cores, always cut neat and clean, always shared. The sun was starting to sink toward the western hills when Bradley found the next campsite. This one was different from the morning camp, more permanent somehow. Morrison had taken time to build a proper fire ring, had cleared the ground of rocks and sticks, had even built a small windbreak out of dead branches. It was the kind of camp a man made when he planned to stay for a while, when he needed to rest and think and figure out what came next. But Morrison was gone, and the fire was cold. Bradley dismounted and walked around the camp, looking for clues about how long Morrison had stayed and which direction he had gone when he left. The mare followed him, ground-tied by long habit, her head down as she searched for grass among the rocks. It was the mare who found the next sign. She had wandered over to a flat rock near the edge of the camp and was sniffing at something on the ground. Bradley went to see what had caught her attention and found himself staring at something that made his blood run cold. Blood. Not much, just a few drops on the stone, but fresh enough that it was still dark red instead of brown. Someone had been hurt here, and recently. Bradley looked around the camp with new eyes, seeing things he had missed the first time. Scuff marks in the dirt that could have been from struggle. A piece of torn cloth caught on a thorn bush. And there, near the fire ring, something that made his hands shake as he picked it up. A piece of paper, folded small and stained with what looked like blood. Bradley unfolded it carefully, afraid of what he might find inside. It was a letter, written in a woman's careful handwriting. The ink was faded, the paper worn soft from being carried and read many times. Bradley read the first few lines and felt the world shift around him like sand in an hourglass. "My dearest Jake," it began, "I hope this letter finds you well and safe. Little Emma asks about her papa every day, and I tell her you're coming home soon. I tell her you're a good man who just made some bad choices, and that good men can always find their way back to the people who love them." Bradley read the whole letter twice, his hands trembling with something that might have been anger or might have been sorrow. Jake Morrison had a wife, had a daughter who called him Papa and waited for him to come home, had people who still believed in him, still saw something worth saving in a man who robbed stores and shot lawmen. The mayor nudged his shoulder gently, and Bradley looked up to find her watching him with dark, understanding eyes. She didn't know him well enough to trust him completely, but she knew hurt when she saw it. Knew the look of a man who had just discovered that the world was more complicated than he wanted it to be. Bradley folded the letter carefully and put it in his shirt pocket, right over his heart where it felt heavy as a stone. Somewhere ahead of him, Jake Morrison was running toward whatever came next, probably not knowing that he had dropped the most important thing he carried. And somewhere behind them both, a wounded shopkeeper was telling his story to anyone who would listen, adding one more crime to Morrison's long list of sins. But all Bradley could think about was a little girl who asked about her papa every day, and the way Jake Morrison cut apple for his horse with the patience of a man who still remembered how to love something. The borrowed mare stamped her feet, ready to continue the chase, but for the first time in 2 years, Sheriff Tom Bradley wasn't sure he wanted to catch the man he was hunting. Jake Morrison pulled the stolen money from his pocket for the third time in an hour, counting the bills with fingers that wouldn't stop shaking. $43. Not even enough to buy passage on a train heading east, not enough to disappear into some city where no one knew his face or his name. Just enough to keep him running for another week, maybe 2 if he was careful with it. The money was stained with Henry Walsh's blood, dark spots that had dried to the color of rust. Jake had tried to scrape it off with his fingernails, had tried to rub it away with dirt and spit, but the stains wouldn't come clean. They seemed to spread instead, like the blood was still wet, still warm from the old man's body. Dusty walked beneath him with a different gait than before, slower and more deliberate, like the horse was thinking about each step instead of just following the familiar trails. They had been climbing into the mountains for 2 days now, following paths that Jake knew as well as he knew his own name. These were the trails that had kept him alive for 3 years, the secret ways through rock and timber that only outlaws and Indians knew about. But something felt wrong. The trails seemed to twist back on themselves now, leading him in circles instead of towards safety. Twice they had come to places Jake was sure he had never seen before, even though Dusty acted like he knew exactly where they were going. And once, just after dawn that morning, Jake could have sworn he heard the sound of another horse somewhere behind them, the echo of hoofbeats bouncing off the canyon walls. The sun was high overhead when Dusty finally stopped at a creek that ran clear and cold over smooth stones. The horse lowered his head to drink, but when Jake started to dismount, Dusty stepped sideways, away from the water's edge. "What's wrong with you, boy?" Jake asked, but his voice came out rougher than he intended. He hadn't spoken to another living thing since he left Cedar Flats, and his throat felt raw from the silence. Dusty turned his head and looked at Jake with those dark eyes that seemed to see everything. The horse took a step toward the creek, then stopped and looked back again, as if he was trying to tell Jake something important. Jake slid down from the saddle and walked to the water's edge. The creek was so clear he could see every pebble on the bottom, could see his own reflection staring back at him from the surface. But it wasn't a face he recognized anymore. The man looking back at him had hollow cheeks and eyes that had seen too much, had done too much. There were new lines around his mouth, deep grooves that spoke of years spent frowning instead of smiling. He knelt by the water and cupped his hands to drink, but stopped when he saw the blood under his fingernails. Henry Walsh's blood, still there after 2 days of riding. Jake stared at his hands like they belonged to someone else, like he was seeing them for the first time. Behind him, Dusty stamped his feet and nickered softly. When Jake turned around, the horse was standing at the very edge of the creek, one front hoof in the water, waiting. "You want me to wash up?" Jake asked. "Is that what this is about?" Dusty didn't move, just stood there with that patient look horses get when they're waiting for humans to figure out something obvious. Jake had seen that look 1,000 times over the years, usually when he was being too slow with the grain or too rough with the saddle. But this felt different. This felt like Dusty was trying to teach him something. Jake rolled up his sleeves and plunged his hands into the cold water. The creek was so clear he could see the blood washing away in dark ribbons that dissolved into nothing before they traveled more than a few feet downstream. He scrubbed his hands until they were raw, scrubbed under his fingernails until they bled fresh blood to replace the old, scrubbed until the water running off his fingers was clear as glass. But when he looked at the money again, the stains were still there. Jake sat back on his heels and stared at the bills spread out on the rocks beside the creek. $43 bought with an old man's pain, earned with violence instead of work. He had told himself it was just business, just survival, just what a man had to do when the world had pushed him into a corner with no way out. But sitting there by the clear water with his horse watching him like a judge, those excuses felt as thin as paper. He thought about Emma, his daughter who was 5 years old now, and probably didn't even remember his face. She would be starting school soon, learning to read and write and count, learning all the things that might help her build a better life than the one he had given her. Mary would have told her that her daddy was away working, would have made up some story that didn't involve guns and blood and wanted posters with his face on them. Jake pulled the letter from his pocket, the one Mary had sent him 6 months ago, through a chain of people who didn't ask questions. He had read it so many times the paper was starting to fall apart along the folds. But he read it again anyway, hungry for the sound of his wife's voice, even if it was just words on a page. "Emma drew you a picture," the letter said. "It's a house with a garden and 3 people standing in front of it. Mama, Papa, and a little girl with yellow hair like hers. She says when you come home, we're going to plant flowers and have a dog and eat supper together every night. She says you're the best papa in the whole world, even though you've been away so long." The words hit Jake like fists, each one a reminder of everything he had lost, everything he had thrown away for the sake of pride and anger and the stupid idea that taking what he wanted was easier than earning it. Emma still believed in him, still loved him, still drew pictures of a life they might have together if he could find his way back to being the man he used to be. But how could he go home with blood on his hands? How could he hold his daughter when those same hands had pulled a trigger and watched an innocent man fall? How could he kiss his wife when his mouth had spoken lies and threats and words that cut deeper than any knife? Dusty moved closer to the water and lowered his head to drink again. This time he didn't stop Jake from kneeling beside him, didn't move away when Jake reached out to touch the horse's neck. The animal's skin was warm under his hand, solid and real and alive in a way that made Jake remember what it felt like to care about something other than his own survival. "A messed up boy," Jake whispered. "Messed up bad this time." Dusty raised his head from the water and turned to look at Jake, drops falling from his muzzle back into the creek. For a moment, they just looked at each other, man and horse, outlaw, and the animal that had carried him through 3 years of running from everything he had done wrong. Then Jake heard it, the sound he had been dreading and expecting in equal measure. Hoofbeats, still distant but getting closer, echoing off the canyon walls like thunder before a storm. Someone was following them, someone who knew these trails well enough to track them through country that should have been safe. Jake stood up and gathered the money, stuffing it back into his pocket without counting it again. The bloodstains would still be there tomorrow, and the day after that, and probably for the rest of his life. Some things couldn't be washed clean, no matter how cold the water or how hard you scrubbed. But as he swung back into the saddle, Jake noticed something different about Dusty's posture. The horse wasn't nervous or ready to run the way he usually was when danger came close. Instead, he seemed calm, almost resigned, like he had been expecting this moment for a long time. "Which way, boy?" Jake asked, but even as he said it, he realized he already knew the answer. Dusty turned away from the creek and started up a trail that Jake had never seen before, a narrow path that wound through the rocks toward the high country. It wasn't the way to safety. It wasn't the way to any of their usual hiding places. It was the way to somewhere else entirely, somewhere Jake had never been, but somehow felt like he was going home. Behind them, the sound of pursuit grew steadily closer, and Jake found himself wondering if running was really what he wanted to do anymore. The horse beneath him seemed to know something that Jake was only beginning to understand, that some trails led away from trouble, but others led straight toward the truth you'd been trying to avoid. And sometimes, if you were lucky, those two destinations turn out to be the same place. The canyon opened up before Sheriff Tom Bradley like a church made of stone and sky. 3 trails came together here in a natural clearing where wildflowers grew between the rocks, and a small spring bubbled up from the earth to form a pool of water so clear it looked like a mirror. It was the kind of place that made a man feel small and significant at the same time, the kind of place where important things happened. Jake Morrison was waiting for him. The outlaw sat on a fallen log near the spring, his hands resting on his knees, empty and open to the sky. His gun lay on the ground beside him, close enough to reach, but far enough away to show he had made a choice. Dusty stood a few yards away, grazing peacefully on the grass that grew thick and green around the water. The horse looked up when Bradley rode into the clearing, but didn't seem alarmed, as if he had been expecting this meeting all along. Bradley's borrowed mare sensed the tension in the air and stepped carefully, her hooves making soft sounds on the rocky ground. The sheriff kept his hand near his gun, but didn't draw it. Something about the scene felt different from what he had imagined during 2 years of hunting. This didn't feel like the end of a chase. It felt like the beginning of something else entirely. "Sheriff Bradley," Jake said without looking up. His voice was quiet, worn down by days of riding and nights of not sleeping. "I figured you'd catch up eventually." Bradley dismounted, but stayed near his horse, watching Jake's face for any sign of deception or sudden movement. The man looked older than his wanted poster, older than his 32 years. There were lines around his eyes that spoke of squinting into too many sunsets, too many mornings spent wondering if today would be the day it all caught up with him. "You're not running," Bradley observed. It wasn't a question. Jake finally looked up, and Bradley was surprised by what he saw in the man's eyes. Not defiance or anger or the cold calculation he had expected from a killer. Just tiredness. The kind of bone-deep exhaustion that came from carrying something too heavy for too long. "Getting tired of running," Jake said. 3 years is a long time to spend looking over your shoulder. Bradley's hand moved instinctively to his shirt pocket, where Mary Morrison's letter rested against his heart. The paper crinkled softly under his fingers, and Jake's eyes sharpened at the sound. "You found it," Jake said. It wasn't a question either. "Your campsite 2 days back. Must have fallen out when you were." Bradley paused, not sure how to finish the sentence. "When you were bleeding, when you were thinking about home, when you were trying to decide whether to keep running or turn around and face what you'd done. When I was reading it for the 100th time," Jake finished for him. "Mary writes me letters sometimes. Sends them through people who don't ask too many questions. I always carry the newest one with me, and when a new one comes, I burn the old one. But I can't bring myself to burn that one. It's got Emma's words in it, things she said to her mama about me." Bradley pulled the letter from his pocket and held it out. Jake stared at it for a long moment before reaching out to take it, his fingers brushing Bradley's for just an instant. The touch was brief, but Bradley felt something pass between them in that moment, some recognition of their shared humanity. "She still believes in me," Jake said, unfolding the letter carefully. 5 years old, and she still thinks her daddy is coming home to plant flowers and eat supper with her every night. "You got kids, Sheriff?" Bradley shook his head. "Wife died of fever before we could have any. Always wondered what it would be like." "It changes everything," Jake said. "The first time you hold them, the first time they look at you like you're the strongest, smartest, best man in the world. It changes everything. Makes you want to be the man they think you are." The two men sat in silence for a while. The only sounds the gentle bubbling of the spring and the soft noises Dusty made as he grazed. Bradley found himself studying Jake's face, looking for signs of the killer he had been chasing, but all he could see was a father who missed his daughter and a husband who had made choices that led him away from everything he loved. "Tell me about Henry Walsh," Bradley said finally. Jake's shoulders sagged, as if someone had cut the strings holding him upright. "The shopkeeper in Cedar Flats. I shot him. Is he dead?" "I don't know." Jake's voice cracked on the words. "I ran before. I just saw the blood and ran. Been seeing it ever since. On the money, on my hands, in my dreams. Can't wash it off no matter how hard I try." Bradley had ridden through Cedar Flats the day before, had stopped to talk to the doctor who had treated Henry Walsh. The old man would recover fully, the doctor said. The bullet had gone clean through his shoulder without hitting anything vital. He would have a scar and some stiffness in the joint, but he would live to see his grandchildren grow up and his wife's apple pies cool on the kitchen windowsill. "He's alive," Bradley said quietly. "Going to be fine." The relief that washed over Jake's face was so strong it was painful to watch. The outlaw bent forward and put his head in his hands, his shoulders shaking with something that might have been sobs, or might have been laughter, or might have been both. "Thank God," Jake whispered. "Thank God." Dusty had wandered closer while they talked, and now the horse stood between the two men like a bridge connecting them. Bradley reached out slowly and touched the animal's neck, feeling the warmth and strength that had carried Jake Morrison through 3 years of running. The horse turned his head to look at the sheriff with those dark, intelligent eyes that seemed to understand more than any animal should. "He's a good horse," Bradley said. "Best I ever had. Saved my life more times than I can count. Never let me down, not once." Jake looked up at Dusty with something that looked like love. "Think he got tired of carrying me away from what I should be facing. These last few days felt like he was taking me somewhere specific instead of just away from danger." Bradley understood. His own horse, Thunder, had been like that sometimes. Animals had a way of knowing things that men spent years trying to figure out. They knew when a storm was coming before the first cloud appeared. They knew when a man was sick before he felt the fever. And maybe, sometimes, they knew when it was time to stop running and start facing the truth. "What happens now?" Jake asked. Bradley looked around the canyon at the 3 trails that came together in this place of water and grass and wildflowers. One trail led back toward Cedar Flats and the man Jake had wounded. One led toward the nearest town with a jail and a judge and the machinery of justice that would decide Jake's fate. And one led up into the high country toward passes that would take a man to Mexico or California or anywhere he wanted to disappear. "That's up to you," Bradley said finally. "I came here to arrest you, bring you back to face what you've done. But sitting here now, talking to you, I keep thinking about that little girl who draws pictures of houses and gardens. Keep thinking about what it would mean to her if her daddy never came home." Jake stood up slowly and walked to the spring. He knelt by the water and cupped his hands, drinking deeply of the clear, cold water that bubbled up from somewhere deep in the earth. When he was finished, he splashed water on his face and looked at his reflection in the pool. "I can't go home like this," he said. "Can't hold Emma with these hands. Can't kiss Mary with this mouth that's told so many lies. But maybe if I face what I've done, if I made it right somehow." "Henry Walsh is a good man," Bradley said. "Forgiving man. If you went to him, apologized, maybe paid him back for what you took and what he spent on the doctor, might be a start." Jake turned away from the spring and looked at his gun lying on the ground. For a moment, Bradley tensed, wondering if the outlaw was going to make a play for it. But Jake just stared at the weapon like it was a snake that had bitten him. "I'm tired of that thing," Jake said. "Tired of what it makes me do, what it makes me into. Emma shouldn't have a daddy who solves his problems with a gun. Then don't be that daddy anymore." The words hung in the air between them, simple and true and heavy with possibility. Jake looked at Bradley, really looked at him, and the sheriff saw something changing in the outlaw's eyes. Not surrender exactly, but something like hope. "You let me try?" Jake asked. "Let me go back to Cedar Flats and face Henry Walsh? Let me try to make things right." Bradley thought about the letter in his pocket. about a little girl who still believed her daddy was a good man. Thought about his own father, who had taught him that justice wasn't always about punishment, that sometimes it was about giving people the chance to be better than they had been. "I'll ride with you," Bradley said. "Make sure you get there safe. Make sure Walsh gets his apology. After that, well, that'll be up to the law and the judge and what's in your heart." Jake walked over to his gun and picked it up, holding it for a long moment before walking to the edge of the canyon. With a motion that looked like it took all his strength, he threw the weapon out into the empty air. They watched it tumble end over end until it disappeared into the rocks far below, lost forever in a place where no one would ever find it. Dusty whinnied softly, as if he approved. "Guess that's settled then," Jake said. He walked to his horse and gathered the reins, but before he mounted up, he turned back to Bradley. "Thank you, Sheriff, for giving me a chance to try to be the man Emma thinks I am." Bradley nodded and climbed back onto his borrowed mare. The horse seemed less nervous now, more willing to trust his hands on the reins. Maybe she could sense that the hunt was over, that they were riding toward something better than violence and capture. As they prepared to leave the canyon, Bradley looked back at the spring where everything had changed. The water still bubbled up from the earth, clear and clean and eternal. The wildflowers still grew between the rocks. The three trails still met in this place where two men had found a way to see each other as more than hunter and prey. Some roads led to running, and some led to hiding, but the best ones led to the place where a man stopped pretending to be someone else and started trying to become who he was meant to be. Under the wide sky, with Dusty leading the way down the trail toward Cedar Flats and whatever came next, Jake Morrison rode toward the hardest and most important conversation of his life, while Sheriff Tom Bradley rode beside him, ready to make sure he got there safe.